Now this comes from an article by Hansen in 2005, but you can see all of these various combinations of quantitative and qualitative strands and the various types of designs that can emerge from them. For example, you have on the left-hand side, when a quantitative and qualitative study are conducted simultaneously, that's concurrent. But certainly, depending on prioritization, that can look very differently, and the designs can look very differently, and you see some of that branching off here. Similarly, thinking of timing and sequential implementation, you can see the large variety of designs that can occur depending on how one prioritizes. And each of these designs tend to have their own terms, labels, and Cresswell labels many of these variants, which we're going to get at here in the subsequent slides. But one point I do want to make here before we proceed is, even though there are certain design typologies that have been preferred within much of the mixed methods literature, that does not necessarily bind one to a certain type of design. There are many, many variants, and depending on one's question, depending on one's mixed methods that are to be employed, sometimes the designs don't fit neatly into one type, and that's fine. I mean, I think what's more important is, like we talked about in part 2, what is the rationale for your mixed methods design? And then just as importantly and relevant to this particular section of slides, what is the design variant that best can address your aims or questions? That being said, let's talk about some of the design types. So the first is the convergent or parallel or concurrent designs. So you see it's sometimes called parallel convergent design, concurrent convergent design. This is when the intent is to merge concurrent or data collected at the same time, quantitative and qualitative data to address study aims, and in this case the investigator combines both quantitative and qualitative research. So I want to provide you an example for some of the work we did. This particular study, we were actually evaluating the feasibility and utility of a tablet or a mobile device that was actually used as a reminiscence tool for people with Alzheimer's disease and then families and staff within long-term care settings. So it was a fairly small sample. I believe we had less than 20 residents participating, but also in addition to their family members and staff. So we had multiple participants, residents, families, and staff. And then in addition to that, we collected multiple types of data within a mixed methods framework. In this case, a parallel convergent mixed methods design. You see on the left-hand side some of our qualitative data collection procedures. It included participant observation as well as semi-structured interviews, both of residents, family members, and staff. And then in our quantitative strand, we included not only background information, but then also we had a checklist that we devised that actually assessed overall utility and feasibility of this tablet program, this tablet app, which was called Memory Matters. You see then we propose how we analyze the qualitative and quantitative data, but then most importantly, you see our point of interface here. This is how we merged the two sets of results. The qualitative and quantitative data in this case were analyzed separately, but then they were compared side by side within the results section to determine, did the findings converge, did they diverge? So that's really important here. This is the point of interface. This is how the two sources of data were integrated. And then finally, we interpreted the merged results. The qualitative data were used to explain and expand upon the qualitative data. And then the points of convergence and divergence and potential reasons for these patterns were synthesized and discussed, both within the results and discussion section. This table wasn't of our own design. This is really based on some of the suggestions that Cresswell provides in his textbook, Cresswell and Plano-Clark, the 2011 textbook. And what's really powerful about this is these schematics can really offer a really useful way to describe the mixed methods design one is utilizing, but in a way that's fairly concise and very easy to understand. In terms of the qualitative strand, quantitative strand, what are the questions? Then how are the data collected? What are the data elements? What are the results or products of those two types of data? And then, as I've emphasized here multiple times on this slide, what is the point of interface? Again, those are three key elements that we had discussed earlier in terms of how we design mixed method studies, and you see them all apparent here in this particular schematic. So a second type of design type, again, coming back to this issue of timing, is the sequentials design. For example, explanatory sequential or exploratory sequential. Explanatory sequential designs are quan arrow to qual. Exploratory sequential are qual arrow to quan. So another design possibility is to have one data set build on the results from the other. These are known as sequential designs, and they may begin by a qualitative exploration followed by a quantitative follow-up or vice versa. So here's another example of work that we've been engaged in that shows you a sequential explanatory design, or a qual to quan. Now what's interesting here is this is a design schematic to actually develop a measure. If you recall from our first module of this series, I talked a little bit about my Mid-Career Development Award, which is really focused on developing better ways utilizing mixed methods to determine how and why families and older adults utilize community-based long-term care. And in this case, the community-based long-term care program I was very interested in are what are called adult day service programs. And within the existing literature, there aren't really good measures out there. And providers, mention this to me all the time when I'm engaging with them. There aren't really good measures to understand how and why families and older clients utilize adult day services. And this is really important from a quality improvement standpoint. If programs don't know why or how their services or activities are working, it's very difficult for them to refine or update or improve or enhance their programming to best lead to key outcomes. And when one looks at the adult day service literature, what's really interesting is when these programs were first evaluated back in the late 70s, early 80s, within randomized controlled designs, oftentimes they were shown not to work effectively in influencing key quote-unquote outcomes. For example, reducing rates of nursing home admission for clients, reducing feelings of stress on the part of family caregivers whose relatives utilize adult day services, et cetera. And what always struck me was that was kind of a black box approach to adult day services, kind of seeing these programs as a quote-unquote intervention, but not really understanding how or why these programs work. And if we better grasp how or why these programs work, perhaps we can then identify better mechanisms to benefit, pathways to benefit for people who actually utilize them. So I thought this was really an issue of devising and developing better measures, and how I decided to do that was to utilize a mixed methods design, the sequential exploratory design. So again, this is based on schematics that Cresswell provides in his book, and I found very helpful in kind of laying out how is this a mixed methods effort. So it really started with qualitative data collection. So what I did was I did essentially mini ethnographies in 2 adult day programs, one in a rural area and one in a suburban area, where I did participant observation for a period of time. I believe it was 3 months. Then also I conducted a series of semi-structured interviews with families and staff as well. And this provided a wealth of information, qualitative open-ended data as to why and how adult day service programs worked or didn't. So what was intriguing, and what I used those qualitative data, after coding, identifying themes, et cetera, was I utilized those qualitative data to essentially create a series of items. I'm really glossing over how complex this is because it's a lot more harder than it sounds, going from transcripts to items. So for example, one can use themes and categories as certain submeasures or certain constructs of interest, and then utilizing quotes to basically derive items themselves. And it took a long time to actually get to that point. But what it provided me with was, I would argue, measures that have superior face and also content validity. When you're thinking of traditional classical measurement theory, establishing face validity and content validity of a given set of items. By utilizing robust qualitative methods, it allowed me to craft items that weren't from my voice, weren't from the voice of prior measures, which is oftentimes how a lot of measures are developed. One does a literature search, maybe one looks at prior measures and then kind of crafts items from that. But it said these were items that were from the voices of family members themselves, the voices of staff themselves. And when I presented these items to providers, for example, et cetera, it really resonated well with them. It certainly resonated with family members and staff too. So I kind of at that point felt like I was on the right track. So again, I took this large bank of items and then I more or less subjected them to formal content validity testing, where I had a series of experts actually look at the items and determine is there redundancies, et cetera, to kind of pare them down, because there's many, many items, as you could imagine. But then now we're at the point where we're actually subjecting these measures to formal construct validity testing. where we have now, and we've administered these items to around 260 family members of adult day program clients across the country, where we're actually going to subject the items, these measures, to formal construct validity, quote unquote, quantitative analyses to determine, again, the underlying empirical subdomains, subdimensions, best measures that then can be utilized and finalized and eventually disseminated to adult day programs throughout the U.S. So again, utilized primarily as stronger approaches to establish quality improvement and quality improvement mechanisms. Again, and this all flowed out of a mixed methods design, in this case a sequential exploratory design. So another design type which we talked about is maybe a little bit harder to wrap one's head around is the embedded or nested design. This is popular in the health sciences, and it's to use quantitative and qualitative approaches in tandem and to embed one in the other to provide new insights or more refined thinking. These designs are called embedded or nested designs. They may be a variation of a convergent or sequential design. So really, and this is where it gets a little difficult because again, an embedded design can be concurrent, it can be sequential as well. But this is really where one embeds a certain strand within kind of a larger strand. And I think the most classic example and why it's so popular in the health sciences is embedding qualitative components within the context of a randomized controlled trial. There are instances, for example, say an investigator is having difficulty in recruiting or enrolling participants in a given randomized controlled trial. Sometimes it's very beneficial to conduct focus groups, conduct some type of qualitative analyses, participant observation in the clinic or whatnot, to get a better sense of why are we having such difficulty enrolling persons. Is it because of the consent process? Is it because how we're marketing our particular project, etc.? Other examples are certainly embedding qualitative elements during the conduct of a randomized controlled trial, ostensibly for not just process evaluation, but then maybe even going a step further and seeing how well the intervention is being received and utilized by those who are randomly assigned to a treatment condition. Finally, qualitative elements can be embedded at the post-RCT phase. This is where, say, for example, and you'll see an example of this from my own work, where one identifies, say, a subsample of participants who responded really well to a given intervention and then a subsample who responded poorly or not at all, and then basically interview them and say how or why did this intervention work for you or not, to really get, again, a better sense of, I would argue, the processes or mechanisms of benefit of a given intervention. Now, that certainly can be accomplished within quantitative analyses per se, doing mediational models, et cetera. But I think adding that qualitative component, again, within this context of a randomized controlled trial, particularly for interventions that aren't easily decomposed into certain elements, I think is a really powerful tool. And again, really helps not only for better understanding the efficacy of a given intervention, but quite frankly, thinking down the line in terms of sustainability of an intervention, maybe in terms of translation or implementation of an intervention. How feasible will it be for us to take this intervention and implement it in different settings or contexts, cultural or otherwise? What needs to be tailored? What needs to be adapted? And really kind of setting the stage for that. So again, this is where I think mixed methods can be a very powerful design tool and choice in those types of designs. And there certainly are examples of embedding quantitative within larger qualitative designs as well. But again, those I think are examples of embedded mixed methods designs. And again, from my current work, you see an example that we're utilizing here. This is a current study that's funded by the Agency for Health Research and Quality, where we're conducting what we call an embedded experimental mixed methods design. And it's very similar to what I just talked with you about in terms of embedding qualitative components within a larger scale randomized controlled trial. So if you look in the upper left-hand side, the kind of square here, this more or less identifies the randomized controlled trial strand of this embedded mixed methods design. You see, we're basically following family members of persons with Alzheimer's disease over an 18-month period, as well as their relatives too. You see some of the key outcomes that we're collecting, as well as how often we are administering surveys to these individuals biannually over an 18-month period. The intervention of interest here is a remote activity monitoring system that can be installed in persons with Alzheimer's disease-related dementia's homes. It's called the eNeighbor for short here, so that's why you see that. And then you see I'm using the quan and qual notation here to identify which strand I'm referring to. The upper right-hand side then talks about the products of this randomized controlled evaluation. Again, we're just talking about the quantitative strand, growth curve models, Cox proportional hazards, and cost effectiveness ratios. Sometimes too, people will not only put the analysis that's being proposed, but then actually what is to be derived from the analysis, odds ratios, coefficients, whatnot. I chose to just select the analyses here because it was a little bit more, I think a little more coherent for people to understand. But then, if you look below the square part of the schematic here, now you start to see where I'm embedding qualitative elements. For example, every 6 months, we administer an open-ended and closed-ended survey for those in the treatment group or those who are randomly assigned to receive the remote activity monitoring intervention that really asks them about overall perceptions of utility, acceptability, and feasibility of the monitoring system. How well is it working for you? So we've created a series of closed-ended items, but then also there are 5 or 6 open-ended items where we collect a good amount of open-ended perceptions of how well the system's actually working. And again, the product in this case will be descriptive statistics and thematic analyses. In addition to that piece that's embedded, the other piece we're embedding is, if you look to the right-hand side of the figure, is just like I had talked about before, we're going to utilize a stratified purposive sampling procedure to identify 20 individuals who responded really well to the remote activity monitoring technology system and then 20 who didn't. And given where we're at in the study, we've been doing these post-RCT semi-structured interviews already. Again, helping us better understand, for those who responded well empirically, at least on the surveys that we administer, or those who didn't, why or how is the system working for you or not? And then again, that gives us some additional robust qualitative data to better understand pathways or mechanisms of benefit. And eventually, when we are done with this evaluation, our point of interface in this case will be integrating the findings from the RCT with these various embedded components to examine points of convergence or divergence as to why and how eNeighbor, this remote activity monitoring technology system, is effective. And we'll do that utilizing matrices, crosstabs, and probably a number of other analytic tools as well to best merge these sources of data together. Now, there's always a risk when looking at something like this and becoming overwhelmed and saying, you know, maybe it's just best if we just first publish the randomized control empirical results, then we're going to publish the qualitative results. It kind of, you know, more or less silo off the various components of a mixed methods design. Now, we may decide to do that to some extent, but I think in the end, to really achieve the best results, I think to really maximize the power of one's embedded design is to find ways and strategies to blend these two things together, the quantitative, or in this case, the RCT results, and then the various qualitative components that have been embedded, because I think that really will add in the end when we actually disseminate this work. Certainly the embedded process evaluation oval there, we've just disseminated our first paper looking and blending some of the data that were collected from these, what we call them system review checklists that were administered every 6 months, in addition to some of the post-evaluation interviews too, which we've conducted a handful. We were able to combine all those data together to actually conduct what I would consider to be a very nice, robust feasibility and acceptability preliminary study of this larger parent project. Finally, I wanted to conclude with multi-phase designs. A multi-phase design emerges from multiple projects conducted over time, linked together by a common purpose. We discussed this a little bit earlier. I see these most commonly in really large-scale program evaluation types of studies that are very complicated and take usually many years to conduct and complete. And oftentimes in those cases, mixed methods studies are taking place at various phases of this much larger program evaluation initiative. To conclude here, again, I want to provide you with what I thought are some very helpful references to help better understand design typologies and really considerations of mixed methods designs. Both of the Cresswell readings are very helpful in this context, as well as the Hansen reading as well. And I just include for you our own study, which provides an illustration of a parallel convergent mixed methods design.